How could a man, outlawed by his own superiors, single-handedly challenge an entire civilization? How did an adventurer, already facing an arrest warrant, dare to wage war on an empire he knew almost nothing about, save for rumors of unimaginable gold? This question is key to understanding one of the most audacious and brutal schemes in human history. His name was Hernán Cortés, a minor nobleman from an impoverished Spanish family, consumed by a hunger for glory and wealth. Diego Velázquez, the governor of Cuba, initially granted him a fleet for a reconnaissance mission. Later, overcome by envy and suspicion, Velázquez ordered Cortés's arrest. But it was too late. Cortés had, in essence, hijacked the expedition. 11 ships, 500 soldiers, a handful of sailors, and 16 horses. This was his entire force against millions. He landed on a hostile shore in a world that appeared on no map. Behind him lay the ocean and an order for his capture. Ahead lay the unknown, mighty Aztec Empire. His men grumbled. Many were loyal to Velázquez and wished to return. They saw the power of the local tribes, heard gruesome tales of human sacrifice, and realized this was suicide. Cortés understood that doubt was a poison that would kill them faster than any enemy. He needed to burn the fear from their hearts. And so he did the unthinkable. He ordered his own ships destroyed. To dismantle them, to sink them, to do whatever it took to cut off their only path of retreat. No turning back, no hope of salvation. It was gold and glory on this land, or death. With this single decision, he transformed a band of mercenaries and mutineers into an army with nothing to lose. And an army with nothing to lose is the most terrifying weapon in history. But who forged this weapon? To understand Cortés, one must return to the poorest and harshest province of Spain, Extremadura, a land where one was born either a swineherd or a conquistador, with no third option. He was a sickly, frail child from an hidalgo family, minor nobility, whose coat of arms was older than the money in their purses. Always in the shadow of his father, an infantry captain, he learned from childhood that nobility without gold was a brand, not a privilege. The world respected power, not blood. At 14, he was sent to study law at the prestigious University of Salamanca. His parents envisioned a judge or an official for him, a comfortable, quiet life within the system. But Hernán suffocated in dusty lecture halls. He lasted only 2 years. He was drawn not to laws but to legends drifting from across the ocean. Tales of fabled cities, of men who left as nobodies and returned as rich, glorified figures. He saw how the system worked, slowly, unjustly, rewarding the patient and obedient. And he was neither. It was there, in Salamanca, amidst books and foreign rules, that he made the decision that would define his entire life. He realized that rules were made to be bypassed by those audacious enough to do so. Honor, law, loyalty, these were all tools by which the strong governed the weak. True power belonged to those who wrote their own laws. He didn't want a career, he wanted a destiny. And he pursued it in the New World, where old orders had not yet taken root. This youthful rebellion against boredom and predetermination became his personal code. He wasn't going to ask the world for a place in the sun. He was going to scorch one for himself with fire and sword. And he was not alone. All of Spain was red hot. 700 years of the Reconquista, a holy war for their own land, had just ended. A whole generation of men, born for battle, suddenly found themselves without an enemy. Hidalgos, knights, mercenaries, they knew only one thing: to fight, plunder, and convert infidels. Now their trade was obsolete at home, and when the old world closed its doors to them, Columbus, unknowingly, opened new ones. The New World was not just land. It was a fever, a mad dream that gripped the nation. A chance for the landless to become a feudal lord, for the poor to become fabulously rich, for the sinner to atone by bringing the cross to savages. Here, across the ocean, the crown's laws were distant and vague. The king was far away and God was high above. This was a territory where biographies were written not in ink but in blood, and where the only social ladder was powered by the blade of a sword. Ports buzzed with rumors. Every ship brought back stories of golden idols, of cities paved with silver, and of entire empires awaiting their conqueror. This was an era where luck was valued more than lineage and audacity more than law. The world was tearing at the seams, old orders crumbling, and on their ruins, new fortunes and new legends arose. Cortés was not an anomaly. He was the perfect product of his time, a time when desperation and ambition blended into the most explosive cocktail in history. Spain itself forged this sword, cruel, greedy, and unyielding, and this world, full of chaos and opportunity, simply waited for the hand that would wield it, the hand of Hernán Cortés. And he moved inland, straight into the beast's maw. The Tlaxcalans, a proud and unsubdued people, eternal enemies of the Aztecs, were the first to stand in his way. Weeks of brutal fighting ensued. 500 Spaniards against an army of thousands. Blood flowed like a river. Cortés's men were on the verge of total annihilation. It was then, when defeat seemed inevitable, that he pulled off his first brilliant maneuver. He didn't finish off the enemy. He offered them peace and an alliance. He convinced his fiercest opponents that they shared a common, far more terrifying enemy, the Aztec Empire. Yesterday's mortal foes who had been killing each other suddenly became brothers in arms. Cortés didn't just win, he absorbed a foreign army, making it his own. With thousands of new allies, he approached Cholula, a sacred city loyal to the Aztec emperor. He was met with honors, flowers, and songs, but Cortés sensed a trap. His spies reported that a massacre was being prepared, and he struck first. At a prearranged signal, the Spaniards and Tlaxcalans unleashed a horrific slaughter in the city. Within hours, thousands of unarmed residents were killed. This was not a battle, but a public execution, a cold-blooded act of terror. News of the Cholula massacre flew ahead of his army, paralyzing the will to resist. He showed everyone he was more terrifying than any of their gods. And finally, Tenochtitlan, the city of dreams, standing in the middle of a lake. Emperor Montezuma, ruler of millions, received the handful of strangers as gods, showered them with gold, and housed them in his palace. He saw Cortés as a messenger from another world. Cortés, in turn, saw him as the key to an empire, and he committed the most audacious act. With a few dozen of his officers in the very heart of the enemy capital, surrounded by thousands of Aztec warriors, he took the emperor hostage. He simply declared that Montezuma was now his guest and would rule the country from the room where he was held captive. The empire was decapitated by one brazen move, without a single shot fired. He wasn't just fighting a war, he was hacking into the operating system of an alien civilization. This was not magic, it was cold calculation, based on one simple truth. Every person has a price, a weakness, and a dream. Cortés was a brilliant psychologist who saw right through people. He didn't command, he seduced. To his soldiers, he didn't sell an order, but a stake in the greatest enterprise of their lives. He spoke to everyone, from captain to common crossbowman, promising exactly what they craved. To one, gold. To another, land with slaves. To a third, glory that would outlive centuries. He created the feeling of an exclusive club, a brotherhood of the chosen, destined to achieve the impossible. Each of his soldiers felt not like a cog in a war machine, but a shareholder who had risked his life for the jackpot. For the indigenous people, he staged a completely different spectacle. Cortés understood that to defeat gods, one must become a god. He transformed his tiny army into a traveling circus of terror and wonder. Horse and rider were a single, unseen monster. Every cannon shot was not a tactical move, but a theatrical display, thunder from the heavens. He spread rumors, used interpreters to learn local prophecies, and masterfully wove himself into their mythology. He didn't just come to conquer, he came to fulfill an ancient prophecy of the return of the white-faced god Quetzalcoatl. It was a grandiose mystification designed to paralyze the enemy's will before the battle even began. But his primary tool was the people he chose. He surrounded himself not with the most noble or experienced, but with the hungriest and most ruthless. Pedro de Alvarado, Gonzalo de Sandoval, these were not just lieutenants. They were wolves from his pack, adventurers just like him, ready for any cruelty to achieve their goal. He assembled a team where personal loyalty to him outweighed allegiance to the king, the church, or any laws. He created a corporation of predators, and he was its CEO. His main weapon was not steel, but knowledge of the human soul, its greed, its fears, and its desperate belief in miracles. But while he played God thousands of miles from home, in Cuba, his arch-enemy, Governor Diego Velázquez, was preparing a deadly blow. Velázquez was furious. His subordinate had not merely stolen his expedition, he was stealing his glory, his gold, and entire empire. The governor assembled a new, far more powerful fleet under the command of Panfilo de Narvaez. His order was simple: find the rebel Cortés, arrest him, and deliver him to Cuba in chains. This was no longer just a pursuit. It was a civil war between conquistadors ready to erupt in the midst of a foreign land. Cortés knew this. He understood that his real battle was not only in the Valley of Mexico, but also in the corridors of power, and he waged it with the same audacity. He began sending ships laden with Montezuma's treasures not to Cuba, but directly to Spain, to King Charles V. This was a brilliant move. He bypassed his superior and appealed to the highest authority. His message was simple: Velázquez offers you reports and promises, while I offer chests filled with gold. Decide who serves the crown better. Behind his back in Spain, his father and powerful lawyers were already at work. They weren't defending him, they were selling his success. They transformed rebellion into a great service, and plunder into the expansion of an empire. Every gold ingot sent by Cortés was not just a bribe, it was an argument that silenced any accusations of betrayal. He was buying legitimacy. Thus began a second, invisible war. On one side stood law, official orders, and offended authority in the person of Velázquez. On the other, unfathomable treasures, audacious genius, and a direct appeal to the crown's own greed. The battle for Tenochtitlan was decided by swords. The battle for the right to possess it was decided by pen, gold, and intrigue at the royal court. And so, right on the coast, Narvaez's army landed, almost 1,000 soldiers, artillery, cavalry, a force capable of crushing Cortés. He was trapped. Ahead lay a hostile Spanish army. Behind him, the Aztec capital, ready to explode at any moment. It was then that he divided his meager forces. Leaving a small garrison in Tenochtitlan, he marched with a handful of his most loyal men to meet Narvaez. It was pure madness. But it was here that he made his main, fatal mistake. He left his most reckless wolf, Pedro de Alvarado, in command. Cortés knew how to wear the mask of a god. Alvarado only knew how to kill. Left alone, surrounded by thousands of indigenous people, he succumbed to paranoia. He saw a conspiracy in a major Aztec religious festival, and without waiting for an attack, he gave an order that turned the sacred ritual into a bloodbath. His soldiers stormed the main temple and carried out a massacre, killing unarmed priests and nobles. In an instant, the fragile edifice Cortés had built on lies, fear, and diplomacy collapsed. The patience of the Aztecs snapped, the mask of a god was torn away, revealing the ugly face of a greedy murderer. The entire city rose in revolt, and Cortés, he performed another miracle. At night, in a torrential rain, he attacked Narvaez's camp, captured him, and promising mountains of gold, swayed almost his entire army to his side. He returned to Tenochtitlan victorious, but entered a city that had already turned into hell. Tens of thousands of enraged warriors besieged the palace where the Spaniards were holed up. Stones and arrows rained down. Even Emperor Montezuma, brought out onto the wall to calm the crowd, was killed. The trap had sprung. The only way out was flight. On one night, which went down in history as La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows, the Spaniards attempted to break out of the city across a narrow causeway. It was a disaster. They were attacked from all sides, by land and by water. Hundreds of his men drowned, dragged to the bottom by the gold they couldn't abandon. Almost all the artillery, gunpowder, and treasures were lost. In a single night, the brilliant puppeteer who held an entire empire in his hands became a fugitive, having lost everything, his army, his treasures, and his aura of invincibility. But broken did not mean defeated. Retreating to his Tlaxcalan allies, Cortés did not mourn his losses. He calculated them. He learned from every mistake and began preparing his revenge with the cold fury of an engineer. He ordered the construction of 13 collapsible brigantines, small ships that his men carried over mountains to be launched into Lake Texcoco. He transformed the land war into a naval blockade. But his main weapon was neither wood nor steel. It was a virus. One of his men brought smallpox from Cuba, and an epidemic swept through Tenochtitlan, decimating the Aztecs by the thousands. It was an invisible ally, far more terrifying than the Tlaxcalans, an ally against whom the indigenous people had neither weapons nor immunity. 93 days of hell. The Spaniards blocked all causeways, poisoned the aqueducts, and began methodically, house by house, demolishing the great city. This was no longer a battle, but an annihilation. When the last Aztec emperor, Cuauhtémoc, was captured, only smoking ruins remained of the dream city. And then the victors asked the main question: where was the gold? It turned out that almost all of Montezuma's treasures had been lost during La Noche Triste. What little was found in the plundered city barely sufficed to cover the royal fifth and Cortés's own debts. The common soldiers who had survived hell received paltry sums. The greatest heist in history turned out to be a swindle for its own shareholders. The Tlaxcalans, his primary allies, got their revenge. But then, a few years later, they themselves were stripped of their independence and subjected to tribute. The Aztec Empire was erased from the face of the earth, but in its place arose New Spain, a colony, where yesterday's allies became just another set of subjects. Spain itself, having acquired these lands, was forever changed. It created new laws, the new laws of the Indies, attempting to curb the conquistadors' brutality and replace their power with that of officials. The crown realized that the wild dogs of conquest were too dangerous when unleashed. The era of lone adventurers carving out kingdoms was coming to an end. In their place came the faceless and omnipotent imperial bureaucracy. The Aztec Empire was destroyed. On its ruins, from blood, ashes, and plague, a new continent was born. And this legacy proved far more enduring than any gold. And what of Cortés himself, the man who gifted his king an entire empire returned to Spain not as a triumphator, but as a petitioner? The power he had conquered with a sword was taken from him by a pen. New Spain was governed by viceroys and officials sent from across the ocean. He, who had cracked the code of an entire civilization, found himself powerless against the bureaucratic machine he himself had set in motion. The last years of his life were spent in endless lawsuits, trying to defend the titles and wealth he believed were rightfully his by conquest. He had created a new world in which there was no place for him. This is the main paradox of his fate. He died almost in oblivion, fruitlessly appealing to courts. But the man died, and the myth was only born. A myth that proved more enduring than Aztec gold and the Spanish Empire itself. It is a legend not of good and evil, but of the force of human will, pushed to its absolute limit. A story of how one man, driven solely by his own greed and genius, can bring down a millennium-old civilization, redraw the world map, and forever alter the course of history. Cortés left no righteous laws or great cities behind. He left an idea. A terrifying and seductive idea that rules exist only for those who fear breaking them. That no fortress is impregnable to audacity, and no god cannot be deceived. He is remembered not because he was a hero or a villain, he was both simultaneously. He is remembered because he is living proof. Proof that history is not just a game of grand systems, armies, and economies. Sometimes, at pivotal moments, history is made by a single predator who dared to step beyond the permissible and force the entire world to play by his rules.